He didn't even look up when he said it. That was the part that stayed with Elena long after everything else had burned down to ash. 5 years of marriage, and Dante Veyron couldn't be bothered to meet her eyes when he ended it. He just set the papers on the table the way a man sets down a bill he's already decided not to pay. Flat, final, slightly bored. And then he poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and waited for her to cry. She didn't cry, but we'll get to that. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who should have known better, passed over, underestimated, made to feel small by the one person who was supposed to see you clearly, then you already understand something about Elena Marlowe. You understand it in your chest, in that specific place where old wounds go quiet but never quite heal. What happened to her that night was not simply the end of a marriage. It was the moment a very powerful man made the worst miscalculation of his life, and 32 black Rolls-Royces were about to prove it. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories we tell on this channel do not go where you expect them to go. Hit the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that dining room. Let's go back to 2:17 in the morning, and the rain, and the papers on the table, and the moment Elena Marlowe Veyron decided to stop being invisible. Well, the rain had been coming down for 3 hours by the time Dante walked into the dining room. Elena heard him before she saw him. The particular weight of his footsteps on marble, deliberate and unhurried. The way a man walks when he's already made up his mind and doesn't feel the need to brace himself for what comes next. She was sitting at the far end of the long table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, watching the windows run silver with water, and she did not turn around when the door opened. She heard him set something down on the table. She heard the flat sound of paper against wood, then silence. She turned. The divorce papers were maybe 18 inches from her hands, thick, professionally bound, the kind of document that takes weeks to prepare, which meant he'd had attorneys working on this while she was sitting at his side at dinners, while she was organizing the household accounts, while she was doing the 100 invisible things a wife does that nobody notices until they stop getting done. Dante was standing at the opposite end of the table with his jacket still on, one hand loosely in his pocket, the other wrapped around a glass of scotch. He looked like a man who had just completed a task he'd been putting off. Not cruel exactly, not satisfied, just finished. "I think we've both wasted enough time," he said. His voice was the same as always, low, controlled. The voice of a man who had learned early that volume was for people who didn't have real power. Elena looked at the papers. She thought about the first time she'd seen him, not as a target, not as a strategic calculation, but as a person. A birthday party for a mutual associate 8 years ago, and Dante Veyron standing near the windows with that same controlled stillness, looking like a man who had locked some essential part of himself behind glass so long ago, he'd forgotten it was there. She had looked at him and thought, without sentimentality, that someone should probably try to reach him before the glass got too thick. She had been arrogant enough to think she could be that someone. She picked up the pen. "Elena, don't," she said quietly. Not angry, not shaking, just quiet in the particular way she'd spent 5 years being quiet. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned very early in life that the words you keep are sometimes more powerful than the ones you release. She read the document. All of it. Every clause and subcategory and carefully worded legal formulation. Dante shifted once, impatiently, but she didn't hurry. When she finished, she signed her name at the bottom in her usual handwriting. Clear, unhurried, slightly old-fashioned, and set the pen down. Then she reached up and removed her wedding ring. She set it beside the papers without looking at him. She stood, walked to the hall closet, and retrieved the one small suitcase she had packed 3 days earlier and hidden behind the winter coats. She'd known this was coming. Not because she'd been told, not because anyone had warned her. She'd known because she was very good at reading the weather inside a room, and for the past 2 months the room had been cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season. "That's it?" Dante said. She paused in the doorway. She didn't turn around. "That's it," she said. And then she walked out of the Calderon estate into the rain. Dante stood in the empty dining room with his scotch and his papers and the wedding ring glinting on the polished table, and he felt, for just a moment, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Not guilt. Not quite. something closer to the sensation of having just made a move in a game and suddenly being unsure whether it was the right one. He shook it off, finished his drink, told himself the feeling was just the strangeness of the hour. He went upstairs. He did not look out the window. Not yet. Elena stood at the bottom of the estate's private road in the rain and pulled out her phone. It was an old model, deliberately so. She dialed a number from memory, let it ring twice, and hung up. That was all. That was the entire communication. A signal that had been agreed upon years before, in a different life, when she and an old woman in a black coat had sat across a kitchen table and made a plan for exactly this contingency. She stood in the rain and waited. The first headlights appeared at the end of the road 9 minutes later. A black Rolls-Royce moved through the dark at a measured pace, its engine nearly silent, its headlights cutting through the downpour with a kind of quiet authority. Elena watched it approach without expression. Then, behind it, a second set of headlights. Then a third. Then she stopped counting because the counting became meaningless. The vehicles just kept coming, one after another, filling the private road from the estate gates all the way back to the main avenue, their engines a low collective rumble beneath the rain. 32 of them. Identical. Black. Immaculate despite the weather, as though the rain itself had decided not to touch them. The doors of the lead vehicle opened. 12 men stepped out and arranged themselves in 2 careful lines. They were large men, all of them, with the particular stillness of people who have been trained to stay calm in situations that would send ordinary men running. They were not dressed like soldiers, they were dressed like executives. But nobody in that driveway had any illusions about what they actually were. From the lead car, a woman emerged. She was 70, perhaps 75, with white hair pinned severely at the back of her head and a black coat that probably cost more than most people's cars. She walked without a cane and without assistance, and the way the men around her adjusted their positions, subtly, instinctively, like iron filings responding to a magnet, made it immediately clear that whatever authority Dante Veyron wielded inside that mansion, it was modest compared to what this woman carried in the simple act of crossing a wet driveway. She stopped in front of Elena. She lowered her head. "Madame Marlowe," she said, "your family has been waiting for you." Elena said nothing for a moment. She looked at the woman, at the lined face, the careful eyes, the hands folded in front of her with the patience of someone who has waited a long time for something she always believed would eventually come. "How many of the original network?" Elena asked. 83% restored, the woman said. "The remaining 17 are in process. Your father's instructions were thorough." Elena nodded once, as if this were simply data she was filing away. She glanced back at the estate. The lights were still on in the upstairs rooms. "He'll be watching by now," she said. "Let him," the woman said. Elena picked up her suitcase and walked to the lead vehicle. One of the men opened the rear door. She got in without looking back. The door closed. The convoy waited. All 32 vehicles, their engines idling, their headlights aimed at the rain, for exactly 45 seconds. Then, as one, they moved. Dante had heard something. He wasn't sure what. A vibration, a change in the ambient sound of the rain, some subterranean sense that the world outside his window had shifted. He set his phone down and crossed to the window of his upstairs study. He looked out. For a long moment he simply stood there. Below, the private road was a river of black steel and white light, 32 identical vehicles arranged with a precision that had nothing accidental about it. The men standing in the rain, the elderly woman in the black coat, his wife, his now former wife, walking toward the lead car with her single small suitcase, her spine straight, her pace unhurried, as though this were an entirely ordinary thing she was doing. Dante put his hand flat against the cold glass. He watched the door close behind Elena. He watched the convoy begin to move. He stood at the window long after the last set of taillights disappeared around the curve of the main road, and the only sound was the rain against the glass, and the only thought that kept surfacing through the wreckage of his composure was this: 32. 32 vehicles. Coordinated. Identical. Waiting. They had been waiting before he'd even placed the papers on the table, which meant she had known. Which meant she had known, and she had signed anyway. Which meant... He stepped back from the window. He sat down on the edge of the leather chair behind his desk. His glass was empty. He didn't refill it. He was thinking. For the first time in a very long time, Dante Veyron was thinking very carefully, and what he was thinking about was every conversation he'd had with his wife in 5 years. The silences he'd read as passivity, the stillness he'd read as contentment, the careful questions she occasionally asked that he'd brushed off as wifely curiosity. And he was rearranging all of it in his mind, putting each piece back in a different frame. And the picture that was forming was not the picture of a quiet woman who'd wasted 5 years beside the wrong man. It was the picture of someone who had been watching him the whole time. His phone rang. He let it ring 4 times before he picked up. Dante. It was Caruso, his head of security. The man sounded strange. "We have a situation." "I know." "You saw the vehicles?" "I saw 32 of them. What do we know?" A pause. Longer than it should have been, from a man who had been in this business 20 years and prided himself on having an answer ready before the question finished. "We ran the plates on 6 of them before they cleared the road. They're all registered to the same company, a holding entity out of Delaware." Another pause. "Dante. The holding entity's parent company traces back to a name I haven't heard in 12 years. Dante waited. "Marlowe," Caruso said. The rain hit the window. "The Marlowe Syndicate," Caruso said, and his voice had gone flat in the way voices go flat when a man is trying to prevent himself from sounding afraid. "We thought they were gone." "So did I," Dante said. He hung up. He sat in his study for a long time after that, the empty glass in his hand, the rain on the windows, the house around him suddenly feeling less like a stronghold and more like a set piece, a stage he'd been performing on, surrounded by an audience he'd never once thought to look for. Elena Marlowe. He turned the name over in his mind. Her original name. The name she'd carried before she married him. The name he'd heard maybe 3 times in 5 years because she never used it, because she'd seemed perfectly content to be Elena Veyron, because he'd assumed. He stopped. He had assumed. He had assumed quite a lot, it turned out. The Marlowe estate was 40 minutes north of the city, set back from a secondary road behind a half-mile of trees that nobody who wasn't looking for it would ever find. It had been kept maintained but deliberately unlived in during the years of the family's apparent disappearance. The lights running on timers, the grounds kept by a rotating crew who'd been told only that the property was privately owned and not currently occupied. When Elena's convoy turned through the gates, the lights were on. All of them. She stepped out of the car and stood for a moment in the drive, looking at the house. It was large and old and built from stone that had darkened over decades to the color of old iron. She had grown up here. She had learned to read in the library on the 2nd floor. She had sat at the kitchen table with her father on winter mornings when the whole world felt manageable and contained. She had stood on the front steps the night everything collapsed, watching the men her father trusted most drive away with the things they'd stolen. And she had been 19 years old and burning so quietly that nobody who looked at her would have known. She went inside. The woman in the black coat. Her name was Vera Lane, and she had been the Marlowe family's chief counsel since before Elena was born, came to stand beside her in the entrance hall. "There's a briefing ready when you want it," Vera said. "Finance, personnel, current intelligence. The network has been activated as of tonight." "Did anyone outside our circle notice the convoy?" 3 Veyron street-level assets observed the departure from the estate. They'll report within the hour. Elena nodded. "Good." She set her suitcase down at the foot of the stairs. "I want everything on Victor Sable on my desk by morning." Vera looked at her. "You know about Sable already?" "I've known about Sable for 6 months," Elena said. "I didn't know enough to move. Now I do." She started up the stairs. She was tired, deeply tired, in the way you get tired when you've been performing a version of yourself for years and the performance has finally ended. But underneath the tiredness was something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, because feeling it required being in a position of sufficient strength that she could afford the honesty of it. She felt clear. She felt absolutely, dangerously clear. "Vera," she said without turning around. "Yes." "He'll try to contact me within 48 hours. "Dante?" "He'll want answers. He'll frame it as wanting the truth, but what he'll actually want is to reassert control over a situation he suddenly doesn't understand." She reached the top of the stairs and paused, her hand on the railing. When he reaches out, I want every piece of the Sable file ready. Because when Dante finally starts asking the right questions, he's going to need to understand that the enemy he's looking for has been sitting at his table for years. And if he doesn't ask the right questions? Elena was quiet for a moment. Then he deserves what's coming, she said, and I'll watch it happen from a distance. She walked down the hall to her father's old study, the room she'd claimed as her own the year she turned 22, the year she'd stopped waiting for someone to give her permission to begin. The desk was exactly as she'd left it. The lamp was on. On the blotter, in a neat stack, were the initial briefing documents Vera had prepared: photographs, financial records, surveillance summaries, the dense papery evidence of a network that had spent years rebuilding itself in the dark. Elena sat down. She opened the first file. She read for a long time. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean of the night's ordinary sins, indifferent to the much larger machinery that had just been set into motion on its streets. By morning, 3 things had happened. The first, Dante's primary legal team had made discreet inquiries into the Marlowe corporate structure and returned with nothing useful. The entities were nested inside other entities, each layer more opaque than the last. The whole architecture designed by someone who understood that the best hiding place isn't darkness, it's complexity. The second, Victor Sable arrived at the Calderon estate at 7 in the morning without being invited. He was 61 years old and had the kind of face that looked trustworthy by habit rather than by nature, heavy-featured, open-eyed, with a practiced warmth in his expression that he deployed like a tool. He was Dante's mother's younger brother. He had been present at every major decision the Veyron organization had made for the last 20 years. He poured himself coffee in the kitchen as though he owned the space and said, "I heard about Elena. I'm sorry, Dante. I know that's hard." Dante looked at him. "She wasn't who I thought," Dante said. "Nobody ever is," Victor said and smiled. Dante said nothing else, but he watched his uncle's hands, the way they moved around the coffee cup, the slight relaxation in the shoulders, the microscopic satisfaction in the eyes that appeared and disappeared in less than a second. He had known Victor for 38 years. He could read that face the way some men read weather. Victor was not sorry. Victor was pleased. The third thing that happened, at 9:47 a.m., an encrypted message arrived at Dante's private server through a channel that was supposed to be known only to his inner circle. 4 words. "The Marlowe archive has been activated." Dante read the message 3 times. He didn't reply. He forwarded it to Caruso with one instruction: find out who sent it. He already had a suspicion, but suspicion in his business was a luxury. What he needed was something he could use. By noon, 2 of his financial accounts showed irregularities. Nothing catastrophic yet. Exploratory. The kind of probing a surgeon does before making a cut. Methodical, precise, learning the resistance of the tissue. By 3 in the afternoon, one of his longest-standing captains, a man named Bracco, who had been with the Veyron organization for 16 years, called to say he was stepping back from his responsibilities for personal reasons and wished Dante well. Dante hung up the phone and sat very still. In the world he lived in, personal reasons meant someone had made Bracco a better offer, or a more frightening threat, and Bracco was not a man who scared easily. He picked up his phone again. He started to dial Elena's number. He stopped. He set the phone down. He was not yet ready to make that call, because making it meant admitting something he wasn't fully prepared to admit, that the woman he'd dismissed across a dining table at 2 in the morning might be the only person in his current situation who knew more than he did. And Dante Veyron had spent his entire adult life being the person who knew more. He went to the window again. The road outside was empty. The rain had stopped. The ordinary daylight made everything look deceptively simple and manageable, the way daylight always does, right up until it doesn't. He thought about 32 black cars in the dark. He thought about the way Elena had picked up the pen. No hesitation, no final appeal, no last glance at the life she was leaving. She had been ready. She had been ready for a very long time, and he had never once thought to ask himself what she might be ready for. He turned from the window. He needed information. He needed to understand what the Marlowe archive actually was, what it contained, and who else knew it had been activated. He needed to get ahead of whatever was coming, The frozen accounts, the departing captains, the encrypted messages arriving through channels he'd thought were secure. He needed, though he did not yet fully understand this, to accept that the last 5 years of his life looked entirely different from the outside than they had from inside his own assumptions. But that understanding was still a few days away. For now, Dante Veyron stood in his empty estate and made a list of things he thought he knew. He was wrong about most of them. Dante made the call at 11:14 the following night. He'd held out longer than he expected to, which was either discipline or pride, and by that point in his life he'd stopped being able to tell the difference between the two. He sat in the study with the desk lamp on and the rest of the house dark, and his phone face up on the leather blotter for 3 hours before he finally picked it up. He didn't rehearse what he was going to say. Men like Dante Veyron didn't rehearse. They walked into rooms and expected the room to adjust. Elena picked up on the second ring. "I wondered when you'd call," she said. Her voice was the same, quiet, measured. The particular stillness that he had spent 5 years interpreting as the sound of a woman who had nothing complicated going on inside her. Understood now, in the specific way you understand something after the damage is already done, that he'd been listening to the surface of a very deep river and calling it shallow. "I need to know what the Marlowe archive is," he said. A pause. Not the pause of someone thinking, the pause of someone deciding how much to give. "You need to know a lot of things," she said. "Elena, Bracco called you yesterday," she said. "Before he called you, he called me. He wanted to know whether I was going to maintain the existing territorial agreements or renegotiate. That's what stepping back for personal reasons means, Dante. It means someone offered him a better structure. It means he's already made his decision, and the call to you was professional courtesy." Dante's jaw tightened. "Who offered him the structure?" "That's the right question." Another pause. "But it's not the first question. The first question is why someone inside your organization has the kind of access that makes a 16-year captain willing to walk." "Tell me who." "Not like this," she said. "Not on a phone." "Elena." "I'll be at the Hartwell building tomorrow at noon," she said. "The old conference suite on the 14th floor. It's still technically a Marlowe property, which means it's neutral ground. Come alone or don't come at all." She hung up. Dante held the phone for a moment, then set it down. He looked at the wall across from his desk, a section of paneling that was, if you knew where to press, the front of a concealed cabinet. Inside the cabinet were things he hadn't needed to look at in a very long time. Old maps, older files, the kind of documentation that a cautious man keeps, not because he expects to use it, but because the world has a way of cycling back to old problems. He stood up, crossed the room, and opened the cabinet. He pulled out a file that was 12 years old and covered in dust and sat back down at his desk and opened it under the lamp. The name at the top of the first page was Marlowe, R. For Richard Marlowe, Elena's father, dead these past 12 years of a cardiac event that had been ruled natural by a medical examiner who was later found to have accepted payments from a source that was never officially identified. Dante had always assumed he knew who that source was. Now he wasn't sure he'd assumed correctly about anything. He arrived at the Hartwell building at 11:52. He came alone, which cost him more than he wanted to admit. Every instinct he'd built over 20 years said, you don't walk into a meeting on someone else's ground without people covering the exits. But Elena had said alone, and whatever else had fractured between them in the last 48 hours, he still understood her well enough to know that she'd chosen the word deliberately and would know instantly if he'd violated it. The 14th floor conference suite smelled of old carpet and disuse. The windows looked out over the east side of the city, gray and flat under low November clouds. Elena was already there, standing at the far end of the room with her back to the door, looking out at the skyline. She was wearing a dark jacket and her hair was down, which he hadn't seen in months. She'd kept it up for so long at the estate that he'd almost forgotten it was as long as it was. She didn't turn around when he came in. "Close the door," she said. He closed it. "Sit down." He didn't sit. He stood near the head of the table and watched the back of her head and thought about the filing cabinet and the 12-year-old documents and the medical examiner who'd been bought. And he felt the particular pressure behind his eyes that he associated with situations where the thing you thought you were managing has quietly become the thing managing you. "You're not going to sit," she said. It wasn't a question. "Tell me about the archive." She turned then. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you're trying to determine not what they know, but what they're actually ready to hear, calibrating, measuring, deciding. He'd seen her do it before and always thought it was a habit of timidity. He didn't think that anymore. My father built it over 30 years, she said. Financial records, intelligence files, political leverage, documentation on every major criminal and legitimate power structure on the East Coast, communications intercepts, testimony from people who are now dead. She moved to the table and set both hands flat on the surface. He called it his insurance policy. He spent 30 years making sure that if anyone ever tried to dismantle the Marlowe organization, they'd understand the cost. And it was transferred to you. Before the collapse. Yes. Before he died. Before he was killed, she said. Her voice didn't change, but her eyes did. A slight contraction, a pulling inward, the look of someone who has trained themselves to carry a specific weight without showing the strain but hasn't quite finished the training. I know you had questions about how he died, Dante. I know you looked into it. I know what you concluded. He said nothing. You were wrong, she said. Whatever you concluded, you were wrong. My father wasn't killed by a rival family. He wasn't killed because of a territorial dispute or a debt or any of the ordinary reasons people in this world die. She straightened. He was killed because someone close to him wanted the infrastructure he'd built and understood that the only way to get it was to remove him before he could transfer it to the next generation. Dante felt something shift under his feet. Not literally. Something structural. The weight redistribution of a man who has been standing on what he thought was solid ground and has just understood it isn't. Someone close to him, he said. Someone close to both families, Elena said. The room went quiet. Outside, a truck moved along the street 14 floors below. Somewhere in the building, an elevator hummed. Say the name, Dante said. I'm not ready to say the name, she said. Not yet. Because when I say it, everything changes, and I need to know you're actually prepared for that before I give you something you can't unknow. Elena, 3 of your accounts were accessed this morning, she said. Her voice went flat and informational, like someone reading from a document. Not frozen, accessed. Someone used the internal authorization codes to run pattern analysis on the transaction histories, looking for what I don't know yet. But I know the codes used are at the level 3 clearance tier, which means whoever did it either has that clearance themselves or has someone inside who does. Dante's hands tightened. He didn't realize it until he felt the pressure in his knuckles. How do you know that? He said. Because Vera Lane has been monitoring your network architecture for 4 months, Elena said simply. Not because I wanted to spy on you, because 4 months ago I discovered that someone else was already inside it, and I needed to know the extent of the penetration before I could figure out what they were building. The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence than the ones that had lived between them at the estate. Those had been comfortable in the way that a house you've stopped seeing clearly can feel comfortable. This one had teeth. This one asked him to sit with the specific discomfort of understanding that while he thought he'd been running his organization had been running without his knowledge in directions he hadn't authorized. 4 months, he said. Yes. You were still living in my house 4 months ago. I know. You were monitoring my network from inside my house. I was trying to protect it, she said, and her voice cracked slightly. Not with emotion exactly, but with the effort of maintaining neutrality around something that wasn't neutral at all. That's not a justification. I'm not asking you to be okay with it. I'm telling you what happened. Dante turned and walked to the window. He looked out at the gray city and breathed slowly, the way you breathe when you're preventing a reaction rather than having one. He thought about the evenings she'd sat in the study while he worked. Reading, she'd said, always reading. And how he'd found it easy to forget she was in the room. How he'd taken that easiness as evidence that she wasn't paying attention. Who's inside my network? He said, his back to her. Victor, she said. The name hit him like a hand against the back of the head. Not violent, but disorienting, the way a sudden impact makes you briefly unsure which direction you're facing. He turned around. Elena was watching him with the specific steadiness of someone who has been waiting for this moment long enough that when it arrives, even the hard parts of it feel like a kind of relief. That's not possible, he said. I know that's what you think. Victor has been with this family since before I was in the organization. He was the one who... He stopped. He started again. He trained half my current captains. I know. He's the one who told me the Marlowe family was no longer a factor, 12 years ago. He's the one who brought me the intelligence that said your father's empire had collapsed. Yes, Elena said. He was. The implication arrived fully formed, and it was bad enough that Dante's first instinct was to reject it outright, to say no, not possible, I would have seen it. Because accepting it meant accepting that 20 years of loyalty had been a performance, and that every major decision he'd made in that time had been shaped in part by information provided by a man who was working against him. Show me, Dante said. His voice had gone flat. Not calm, flat, which is what calm becomes when it's holding something very large very tightly. Show me what you have on him. Elena reached into her jacket and set a USB drive on the table. That's a partial copy, she said. Enough to begin understanding the scope. The full archive stays with Vera until I decide it's the right time. He looked at the drive. He didn't move toward it. Why are you giving me this? He said. You owe me nothing. I signed the papers. You signed them too, she said. And you're right that I don't owe you anything. She pulled her jacket straight, the gesture of someone preparing to say something they've decided to say, regardless of the consequence. I'm giving you this because Victor isn't only going after you. He's going after what's left of my family's network. He wants everything both families built, and the only way he gets it is if we're fighting each other while he moves from behind. Then we're both targets. We've been targets since before the divorce, she said. The divorce was convenient for him. It separated us and gave him a narrative. The Veyron boss whose wife turned out to be the enemy. The Marlowe heir who married into the family that destroyed her father. She looked at him steadily. He doesn't know I know any of this. He thinks I'm here to dismantle you. Dante stared at her. And are you? She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. I'm here because Victor needs us pointed at each other to complete what he's building. And I'm not willing to be used as someone else's weapon, even against you. She moved toward the door. Read the files, all of them. When you're ready to have the real conversation, you know how to reach me. Elena. She stopped. The accounts he accessed this morning, Dante said. What's he looking for? She turned back, her hand on the door frame. Her expression shifted slightly, not softening, exactly, but acknowledging something. Your succession documentation, she said. He's not just trying to take what you have. He's trying to transfer it to himself in a way that looks legitimate. He needs your authorization codes, your succession architecture, your recognition from the allied families. She paused. He's been building toward this for at least 3 years, possibly longer. The divorce gave him the window he needed. She left. Dante stood alone in the conference suite with the USB drive on the table in front of him and the gray city outside the glass, and he became aware, slowly, and with the specific unpleasantness of a man who has prided himself on seeing clearly, that he had been the last person in his own organization to understand what was happening to it. I went back to the estate and he read. He read for 7 hours straight, taking no calls, eating nothing, drinking 2 cups of coffee that went cold beside the keyboard. The files on the drive were dense and cross-referenced with the precision of someone who had been building a case over months rather than assembling it in a crisis. Financial records linking Victor's personal accounts to shell companies that serviced 3 of the families Dante had believed were neutral. Communication logs showing Victor as an intermediary in deals. Dante had been told were failing due to rival interference, and this was the one that made Dante push back from the desk and press his hands over his face and sit like that for a full 2 minutes. A surveillance transcript from 14 months ago in which Victor was recorded telling an unidentified third party that Elena Marlowe was going to be, in his exact words, the perfect disaster. The perfect disaster. Not a threat. Not a problem to manage. A tool. Something to be deployed. He thought about the night of the divorce papers. Victor had called him that afternoon casual and warm, the way he always was. And he'd said gently that he'd been hearing things about Elena. Nothing specific, just that she might not be entirely who she seemed, and that Dante deserved better. He'd said it like a man who cared about his nephew's happiness. He'd said it like a man who had nothing to gain. Dante picked up his phone. He called Caruso. How quickly can you get full surveillance on Victor? He said. Off book. Nothing through the regular channels. A pause. 24 hours. Make it 12. He hung up. He looked at the transcript again. The perfect disaster. He thought about Elena's face in the conference suite, the flatness of it, the control, the way she'd watched him process each new piece of information with the patience of someone who had been carrying this alone for a long time and had finally handed part of the weight to someone else. She'd known for 6 months. She'd been living in his house for 6 months, sitting in his study, sleeping in the room down the hall, while she carried the knowledge that his trusted uncle was systematically dismantling everything around him, and she had not said a word. He thought about why. He thought about every time he'd dismissed her questions as wifely concern, every time he'd stood from the table and ended a conversation because he'd decided it was over, every time he'd answered her with the particular brand of patience that is actually just condescension in a quieter register. Every wall he'd built between them from the very first week of their marriage, because he'd told himself she was safe precisely because she was not involved in his world. She was more involved in his world than anyone he'd ever met, and he had made it impossible for her to tell him. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. The name was Marcus Vale, his legal counsel, a man he'd worked with for 8 years, a man who was present at more sensitive operations than almost anyone else in the organization, a man he trusted because Marcus had always been there and always delivered and had never given him a reason to question it. He stared at the name. He thought about what Elena had said. Someone inside his network, level 3 clearance. I thought about who in his organization had that clearance and also had the specific legal knowledge to run a succession transfer that would look legitimate on paper. His thumb hovered over the screen. He let it ring out. Then he called Caruso again. Add Marcus Vale to the surveillance list, he said. Same parameters. Nothing through regular channels. Vale, Caruso's voice was careful. You sure? No, Dante said. That's why I want the surveillance. He hung up and went back to the files. And 3 hours later, when he found the document he'd been dreading finding, a legal framework for a succession transfer that bore Marcus Vale's professional signature on the methodology and Victor Sable's fingerprints in the substance. He understood that the situation was considerably worse than Elena had told him. Victor wasn't working alone. Victor had help from inside. Long-standing, trusted, access-privileged help. And if Marcus Vale was part of this, then every legal structure Dante had built over 20 years had been observed from the inside, analyzed and mapped for weaknesses by the man who'd helped him build it. He sat in his study in the dark long after midnight and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, the specific texture of being genuinely afraid. Not of Victor, not of what Victor was building, of the gap. The gap between what he had believed was true and what had actually been true, running alongside it all these years like a shadow he'd never thought to look for. He picked up his phone. I was about to call Elena when a second alert came through on his security system. Not an intrusion, not an alarm, but a notification that someone had attempted to access the estate's internal server remotely using a legitimate set of credentials. The credentials belonged to Victor Sable. Dante set the phone down. He looked at the alert for a long time. Victor was moving now. Whatever timeline he'd been working to, something had accelerated it. Maybe Elena's departure from the estate. Maybe the activation of the Marlowe archive. Maybe, Dante thought with a cold clarity that settled over him like winter, Victor had realized that Elena had made contact, that the two people he needed pointed in opposite directions had just spent 2 hours in a room together, and he was no longer willing to wait. Dante stood up from his desk. He walked to the window. The same window from 2 nights ago, the one that faced the private road, the one where he'd watched 32 black cars take his wife away into the rain. The road was empty and dark, but the feeling that had washed through him that night, that vertiginous sense of a floor dropping away, was back now, and this time it wasn't about Elena. It was about understanding, with complete and unambiguous clarity, that someone he had trusted with his life had been engineering his destruction for years, and that the only person who had seen it coming, the only person who had tried to warn him, was the woman he had dismissed across a dining room table at 2 in the morning without ever asking why she was so quiet. He reached for his phone. He called Elena. She picked up on the first ring this time. Victor just tried to access my internal server, he said. I know, she said. Vera flagged it 4 minutes ago. He's moving faster. Yes. Dante pressed his hand against the cold glass. Outside, the trees along the private road moved in a wind he couldn't hear through the thick windows. I found the Vale connection, he said. In the files. A pause. How bad? Bad enough that every legal structure I have is potentially compromised. She was quiet for a moment. Then you understand what we're dealing with. I understand that I have an uncle who's been building a coalition against me for at least 3 years, a legal counsel who's been mapping my architecture from the inside, and a succession framework that could be used to strip recognition from me by the allied families if it gets the right signatures. He paused. I understand that I have probably 48 hours before one or both of them makes an overt move. Less, Elena said. Victor knows we've met. He'll have had someone in that building. Dante's jaw set. How do you want to handle it? Another pause, longer this time, the kind that isn't indecision but is the opposite of it, is someone moving through a sequence of carefully considered options and selecting the right one with the kind of precision that comes from having thought it through long before the moment arrived. Come to the Marlowe estate, she said. Bring nothing that's connected to your regular network. Leave your security detail at the gate. Mine will cover the property. A brief pause. And Dante. What? When you get here, she said, I'm going to show you something my father left behind. Something that Victor has been trying to find for 12 years. Her voice was entirely level. When you see it, you're going to understand why he needs both of us out of the way before he can finish what he started. She hung up. Dante stood at the window for exactly 30 seconds. Then he turned, put on his coat, picked up only his phone and his keys, and walked out of the estate into the cold night without looking back at the room, or the desk, or the files, or the empty glass, or any of the other artifacts of a life he was beginning to understand had been built on a foundation that someone else had been quietly excavating for years. Dante drove himself for the first time in 4 years. No driver, no escort, no one in the passenger seat reading off an itinerary or relaying messages through an earpiece. Just him and the empty roads north of the city and the cold that pressed against the windows and made the heater work for it. He noticed things he'd stopped noticing. The particular flatness of November trees against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was night or early morning. The way the highway lights created a rhythm if you watched them long enough. The sound his own breathing made in a quiet car. He was afraid. He didn't name it that, but it was what it was. He took the secondary road at the turn Elena had texted him. No landmarks, just coordinates, the kind of direction that assumes you'll figure out the rest. And came through the trees at the end of a long unpaved track to find the Marlowe estate lit from within, warm light at every window, a half-dozen men stationed at intervals along the outer perimeter who watched his car approach with the stillness of people who'd already confirmed his identity before he stopped. Elena was at the front door when he got out. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. He must have looked worse than he realized because something moved briefly across her face. Not sympathy, exactly, but recognition. The look of someone who has been where you currently are and remembers what it cost. Come in, she said. The room she brought him to was on the second floor, a large study with walls of bookshelves and a wide oak desk at its center, the kind of room that smelled like old paper and decisions. A woman was waiting, Vera Lane, in a high-backed chair near the window, her white hair immaculate, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving to Dante with an assessment so open and thorough that he felt briefly like evidence being examined. He didn't like it. He also didn't say anything about it. Sit down, Elena said, and this time he sat. She went to the desk. She opened the center drawer and removed a physical key. Heavy, old, the kind cut for a mechanism that predated electronic locks by several decades, and crossed to the far wall where a section of bookshelves opened, on hinges, into a narrow alcove. Inside the alcove was a safe. She unlocked it. What she removed was not what he expected. He had been expecting more USB drives, more documents, more of the dense financial architecture he'd spent 7 hours wading through. What she set on the desk in front of him was a leather-bound ledger, old enough that the cover had cracked at the spine, and a manila envelope that had been sealed with wax the color of dried blood. My father kept digital backups of everything in the archive, Elena said, standing across the desk. But he kept physical originals of the things he considered most dangerous. He called them the settlement documents. She looked at the envelope. He told me once that if he ever needed them, it would mean everything else had already failed. Open it, Dante said. I need you to understand something first, she said. What's in this envelope changes the shape of the last 20 years, not just for Victor, not just for your organization, She looked at him directly. For yours. He held her gaze. Open it. She broke the wax seal. Inside were 3 items. A photograph. A signed agreement on letterhead from a law firm that had dissolved 11 years ago. And a handwritten letter, 2 pages, in handwriting Dante didn't recognize. Elena set the photograph on the desk so he could see it. The photo was 30 years old, judging by the quality of it. Slightly overexposed, the colors flattened in the way that era's film processing produced. It showed 4 men at a restaurant table. A celebration of some kind. Wine glasses raised, jackets off. Dante recognized 2 of them immediately. One was Richard Marlowe, younger than any photo Dante had seen, with Elena's same particular stillness in the eyes, even caught in a moment of apparent warmth. The other was a man Dante had known his entire life, heavier now and older, but unmistakably the same face. Victor Sable. He knew that. He'd already established that Victor had ties to Richard Marlowe predating the collapse. He was about to say so when Elena set her finger on the 3rd man in the photograph. He looked at the face. He didn't recognize it immediately, and then, slowly, the way recognition works when it's working against something your mind is resisting. He did. It was his father. Giulio Veyron. Dead 17 years. The man Dante had rebuilt the organization for had spent 2 decades making something of, had carried as a standard the way some men carry old wounds. His father was in this photograph 30 years ago, raising a glass with Richard Marlowe and Victor Sable, and a 4th man whose face was partially obscured by the angle. "What is this?" Dante said. His voice came out flat, controlled in the surface way of something that is not controlled underneath. The Veyron and Marlowe families were not rivals, Elena said quietly. They were partners. For nearly a decade. Your father and my father built the East Coast infrastructure together. She set the signed agreement on top of the photograph. This is the founding document of the joint enterprise. It outlines the division of assets, the shared network architecture, the succession protocol, everything. She straightened. They split the operation in 1994 because the political exposure was becoming too significant. They agreed to maintain separation publicly while continuing to coordinate privately. Dante stared at the agreement. He could see his father's signature at the bottom. He had seen that signature hundreds of times on the documents of his childhood, school forms, birthday cards, the one letter his father had written to him from a federal holding facility that Dante still had in a box somewhere he hadn't opened in a decade. He knew his father's handwriting. Victor knew about this arrangement, Elena said. Of course he did. He was there. Dante gestured at the photograph. That's not the twist. The twist is... He stopped. He looked at the photograph again. His father, Richard Marlowe, Victor, and the 4th man with the obscured face. Who's the 4th person? He said. Elena placed the handwritten letter on top of everything else. Read the last paragraph, she said. He picked up the letter. The handwriting was his father's. It was dated 8 months before Giulio Veyron's death. It was addressed to Richard Marlowe. And the last paragraph, he read it twice to make sure he was reading it correctly, described a man named Marcus Vail as a jointly retained asset placed within the Veyron legal structure by agreement of both families, intended to ensure that the succession of both organizations remained coordinated, even if the principals were no longer able to communicate directly. Marcus Vail had been placed inside his organization by his father as a shared asset coordinated with Richard Marlowe. Dante set the letter down very carefully. Marcus wasn't recruited by Victor, he said. No, Elena said. He was already there, from the beginning. He was placed there by the founding agreement, she said, as a failsafe, someone who could activate the joint succession protocol if both principals died before completing the transition. She paused. But Marcus Vail is not the man your father placed there 30 years ago. Dante looked up. The original Marcus Vail died in 2003, Vera said from her chair by the window, her voice careful and level. Cardiac event. It was real, unlike some others we've discussed. The man who presented himself to your organization as Marcus Vail in 2004, using documents, professional history, and physical resemblance that were all fabricated at a level of sophistication that suggests significant resources. She paused. That man is not who he claims to be. The study was very quiet. Dante could hear his own pulse. Who is he? Dante said. That, Elena said, is the question we've been trying to answer for 4 months. He needed air. He stood and walked to the window. Not the same impulse as at the estate. Not the habit of a man who retreats to windows because he's learned to maintain distance. This was physical. He needed to move because if he stayed in the chair, he would do something with his hands that he'd regret. He stood at the glass and looked out at the dark grounds and the men moving at the perimeter, and he breathed, and he thought about Marcus Vale, the real one, the fake one, whichever was sitting in a mahogany office on the 42nd floor of the Fairfield building right now with access to every legal framework Dante had built. 20 years. He had trusted Marcus Vale for 20 years. He had told Marcus Vale things he hadn't told Victor, things he hadn't told Caruso. The man had been in the room for the conversations that mattered, had been at the table for the decisions that couldn't be undone, had drafted the legal structure that held the entire organization together. And Dante didn't know who he was. I need everything you have on his real identity, Dante said, still at the window. Everything, whatever Vera's people have found. We have a partial profile, Elena said. We know he has a background in financial intelligence. The sophistication of the corporate structures he's built is beyond standard legal training. We know he arrived in the city in late 2003, before he approached your organization. We know he made contact with Victor Sable within 6 months of assuming the Vale identity. So Victor knows he's not the original. Victor recruited him, Elena said. Victor found him, provided the resources for the identity fabrication, and positioned him inside your organization as a permanent intelligence asset. Dante turned from the window. That means Victor has had a man inside my legal structure since 2004, he said. For 20 years, every major legal decision I've made has been observed and documented by someone Victor controls. Yes, Elena said, and every succession document, every authorization framework, every... He stopped. He ran his hand over his face. He has everything. He doesn't need to access the server. He's had the keys since before I took over the organization. Elena said nothing. She let him work through it. She didn't look away. Your father knew, Dante said. The letter said Marcus was a jointly retained asset, which means your father knew at some point that the original was dead. I believe so, she said, which is why I believe the fake Vale is connected to my father's death. My father discovered the substitution, or was about to, and someone moved to stop him. The thing that had been building in Dante's chest for the last 20 minutes arrived at its full dimensions. That means Victor killed your father, he said. Or had him killed, Elena said, with Vale's assistance. And then told me your family was no longer a factor. And made sure you had no reason to look into it, she said, because you had no idea the two families were ever connected. Your father never told you. Dante walked back to the desk. He picked up the photograph. He looked at his father's face, younger than Dante's current age, easy in the moment, a man at a table with partners he trusted. He thought about the letter in the box he hadn't opened in 10 years, and whether there were other things in it he'd missed because he'd been reading it as a son, not as an heir trying to understand what he'd inherited. He set the photograph down. Victor's moving in the next 48 hours, he said. We both agreed on that. Less now, Vera said. We received intelligence an hour ago that Vale contacted 3 of the Allied family heads this afternoon. He presented them with documentation suggesting that you are planning to dissolve the alliance structure and consolidate independently. She paused. He used your own letterhead, your own authorization codes. He told them you'd already begun the process. Dante stared at her. He's already started the transfer, he said. He's building the narrative that justifies it, Elena said. By the time you try to contradict him, he'll have 3 family heads who received documentation from your own offices. The dispute becomes, he said, she said. And in that environment, Vale's legal framework, the one he's spent 20 years building, is the arbiter. Dante's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Caruso. He answered it. What? Dante. Caruso's voice was wrong, stripped of its usual professional armor, down to something raw beneath. We have a problem. Tell me. The surveillance on Victor. A pause. Heavy. He made our man, 20 minutes ago. He had him brought into a building on Fenwick Street. Another pause. Dante. He sent us a message. Dante waited. Victor says the surveillance confirms you've been conspiring with the Marlowe organization against the Veyron family. He says he has the evidence. He's called an emergency meeting of the allied families for tomorrow morning. Caruso's voice dropped lower. He's invoking the challenge protocol. Dante's hand tightened around the phone. The challenge protocol was old. Older than Victor, older than Dante. A piece of organizational law that predated the current alliance structure by a generation. It allowed any senior member of the organization to call a formal challenge to the leadership's legitimacy if they could demonstrate that the leader had acted against the interests of the family. It required a gathering of the allied heads. It required a formal hearing, and if the challenge was upheld by a simple majority of those present, the challenger assumed control automatically. "Who's presiding?" Dante said. "Veyron," Caruso said. "Victor nominated him as neutral counsel." "Of course he did." "How long do I have before the meeting?" 14 hours, Caruso said. Dante hung up. He stood in the study with Elena and Vera and the photograph and the letter and the weight of 20 years of carefully constructed assumptions, and he understood that the situation had just crossed from dangerous into something that didn't have a clean word for it. Victor had his surveillance man. Victor had the allied families called. Victor had Veyron running the legal framework. In 14 hours, a room full of people who had no reason to disbelieve a 20-year legal counsel and a 61-year-old consigliere with a carefully manufactured grievance was going to vote on whether Dante Veyron still had the right to run his own organization. And Dante had a photograph, a letter, and the woman he'd divorced. He looked at Elena. She was watching him with that same calibrating look from the conference suite, measuring not what he knew, but what he was capable of. "Say it," he said. "You can't fight this through the existing structure," she said. Veyron controls the legal framework. Victor controls the narrative. The allied families will hear whatever those two men decide they should hear before you get a single word in. I know that, which means the only way you win tomorrow is if you walk into that room with something that makes Victor's entire case collapse before he can build it. She held his gaze. The photograph alone isn't enough. The letter alone isn't enough. But the archive, can you activate it in 14 hours? She glanced at Vera. Vera said, "The core intelligence files, but the ones with direct documentation of Victor's activities over the last 3 years, and Veyron's identity fabrication, can be packaged and verified in 6 hours. Delivery to the allied family heads before the meeting starts." She paused, calculating. "Is possible if we begin now." "Do it," Dante said. Elena shook her head. He looked at her. "What?" "That's not the only problem," she said. Her voice had changed. A slightly different quality to the flatness, the sound of someone arriving at the part of the conversation they'd been holding back. "Dante, the archive contains documentation on the Veyron family that predates Victor. It contains your father's activities, the joint enterprise, the things both families did to build what they built." She looked at him directly. "If we release the archive to prove Victor's betrayal, we also release the history of what the Veyron-Marlowe partnership actually was. Then we release it. Your father is dead," Dante said, "and so is trying to protect a version of him that apparently never existed." The room went quiet again. This quiet felt different from the earlier ones, heavier, more willing to stay. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not warmth exactly, but the specific recognition of a decision made without flinching. "There's one more thing," she said. He waited. "The meeting tomorrow," she said. Victor will have anticipated that you might try to present counter-evidence. He'll have a contingency." She moved back to the desk and opened the ledger, the old one, cracked spine, her father's handwriting covering the pages in dense columns. "My father tracked every major transaction Victor was involved in for a 5-year period before the family's collapse. There's a line item in here, repeated, monthly, from a source listed only as a 3-letter code that I've been trying to identify for months." She set her finger on the page. Dante looked at the code. MSV, 3 letters. He felt the blood leave his face. MSV, Marcus Samuel Veyron, the name on the fake counsel's professional documentation. But also, if you read it another way. If you read it the way a man who'd just seen his father's signature on a 30-year-old founding agreement would read it, the initials of a name he'd known all his life in a different context entirely. He looked up. Elena's expression told him she'd already reached the same conclusion. "How long?" he said. His voice was barely a voice. "How long has Veyron been paying Victor?" Since before the Marlowe collapse, she said. Which means Vale isn't working for Victor. She paused. Victor is working for Vale. Dante sat down. The whole architecture of what he'd understood reshuffled in the space of a few seconds, and what it reassembled into was worse than anything he'd built it from. Victor wasn't the mastermind. Victor was the instrument. The real hand behind the substitution, behind the 20 years of internal surveillance, behind the coordinated dismantling of both families, was a man whose actual identity they still didn't know, sitting inside Dante's own legal structure with access to everything. Vale called the meeting, Dante said slowly. Not through Victor. He nominated himself as presiding counsel because he's the one who needs to be in the room when the challenge is heard. He needs to be there to control the outcome, Elena said. Victor gets the organizations. Vale gets the archive and the network infrastructure, the things that have actual long-term value. And we're the ones who are supposed to destroy each other in the process. We were, Elena said. He looked at her. You've known about the MSV connection for how long? He said. 48 hours, she said. I didn't bring you in until I understood enough to know which direction it went. You should have told me immediately. If I told you immediately, you would have confronted Vale directly, she said, and then we'd have lost the only advantage we currently have, which is that he believes he's still running this. Dante wanted to argue with the logic. He couldn't because it was correct. He had spent 20 years being direct because directness worked when you were the most powerful person in the room. He was not, at this moment, the most powerful person in anything. 14 hours, he said. 13 now, Vera said quietly. 13 hours to build a case that exposes Vale's real identity, documents Victor's role as his instrument, and delivers enough verified intelligence to the allied family heads that they walk into that meeting already knowing what they're walking into. Dante pressed, and we have to do it without Vale knowing we're doing it, which means nothing goes through any channel he has access to. Which is every channel you currently use, Elena said. Yes. She sat down across from him. First time she'd sat since he arrived. She looked tired. Not broken, not defeated, but tired in the way people look when they've been carrying something heavy across very difficult terrain, and the terrain has just gotten steeper. The Marlowe network is clean, she said. Victor never penetrated it. Vale never had access. Everything we move through Vera's channels is secure. She looked at him across the desk, across the photograph and the letter, and the cracked ledger and the wax-sealed envelope that had contained the shape of a history. Neither of them had been allowed to know. Which means you have to trust me completely for the next 13 hours. Every move goes through this house. Every communication goes through Vera. Every decision gets made in this room. He looked at her. He thought about what trust had meant between them for 5 years, or rather, what the absence of it had meant. The walls he'd built. The distance he'd maintained in the name of protecting her from a world she was, it turned out, more qualified to navigate than he was. All right, he said, it wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the end of what had broken between them. It was simply a man who was still capable of recognizing, when the situation demanded it, which way was forward. Elena nodded once. She looked at Vera. Start the packaging, she said. We go dark on all external communications in 10 minutes. She looked back at Dante. And we need to talk about who Vale actually is, because I have a theory, and if I'm right, the name that comes out of this is going to burn down a great deal more than Victor Sable. She opened the ledger to a page near the back, where the entries shifted from columns of figures to something else entirely. A handwritten note, short, in her father's hand, written with the particular pressure of a man writing something he needed to be absolutely certain would not be misread. She turned the ledger to face Dante. He read the single line. He read it again. Outside, the cold November dark pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the city, in a mahogany office on a 42nd floor, a man who was not who he claimed to be sat with 13 hours and the accumulated leverage of 20 years of patient, meticulous infiltration and waited for the morning to deliver him everything he'd been building toward. He did not yet know that the two people he'd needed to destroy each other were sitting together in the same room, reading her father's last warning, and finally, too late for comfort, but not too late for what came next, beginning to understand the full shape of what they were up against. The single line in the ledger read, "If the archive is ever activated without my authorization, look for the man who benefits from both sides losing. His name is not Vale. It never was. RM." Dante stared at it. Elena watched him read it. She watched his jaw set and his breathing change. A slight shallowing, the body's automatic response to information that the mind hasn't finished processing, but the instincts have already understood. Your father wrote this knowing someone would find it, Dante said. He wrote it knowing I would find it, Elena said. He knew I was the only one who'd activate the archive. He knew I'd read every page. He knew who Vale was. He knew Vale wasn't Vale, she said. Whether he knew the actual name, I don't think so. I think he ran out of time before he could get there. She closed the ledger. But there's one place we might find it. She looked at Vera. Vera was already standing, already moving toward the alcove, already pulling a second item from the safe that Elena hadn't shown him yet. A hard drive in a protective case, matte black, the size of a paperback book, with a physical key lock on the side. The secondary archive, Vera said. Richard kept it separate from the main network. Analog key, no digital entry point, no remote access. It's been sitting in that safe for 12 years. She set it on the desk. We haven't opened it yet because the key was kept separately and only arrived at this house 6 days ago. Where was it before that? Dante said. With Bracco, Elena said. The name landed in the room with the specific weight of a thing that recontextualizes everything around it. Dante thought about Bracco calling him to resign. Bracco stepping back for personal reasons. Bracco, who had been with the Veyron organization for 16 years and had, apparently, also been holding a key to a Marlowe archive drive for an undetermined portion of that time. Bracco worked for your father, Dante said. It wasn't quite a question. Bracco was the last of the original joint enterprise assets, Elena said. He was placed inside your organization the same way Marcus Vale was, except Bracco was legitimate, an actual placement, by actual agreement, as a shared security resource. She paused. He's been waiting for 16 years for the archive to be activated. When it was, he sent the key and stepped away from your organization because his job was finished. He could have told me. His instructions said not to, she said. My father's instructions. I was very specific about the sequencing. Dante looked at the drive. He thought about sequence, about Richard Marlowe, dying or already dead, writing letters and hiding keys, and building contingencies with the patience of a man who understood that the thing he was protecting would need to survive him by years, possibly decades. He thought about Elena, 19 years old on the front steps of this house, watching men drive away with stolen things. He thought about what it cost to build something that careful while carrying that much grief. Vera fitted the key and opened the drive's casing. She connected it to an air-gapped laptop, a machine that had never been connected to any network, that communicated with nothing beyond its own processor. And the drive spun up with a sound like a slow breath. The files loaded. Elena leaned over the screen. She found what she was looking for in 4 minutes. His name was Gerald Holt. Not a crime figure by origin, not a soldier or a captain or anyone who had risen through the traditional structure of organized power on the East Coast. Gerald Holt had spent 12 years as a senior analyst at a federal financial intelligence unit, a man who spent his days mapping the architecture of criminal enterprises, understanding how money moved and hid and transformed itself, learning the internal logic of organizations like the Veyron-Marlowe partnership, with the detached expertise of a scientist studying a specimen. And then, in 1999, Gerald Holt had disappeared from his federal position under circumstances that were listed as a voluntary resignation, but that Richard Marlowe's intelligence files described in considerably more specific terms. An internal investigation into the unauthorized use of classified criminal network data, a quiet removal, and the subsequent appearance of a man with Gerald Holt's precise knowledge base and zero traceable history, inserting himself into the criminal ecosystem he'd spent a decade studying from the outside. He hadn't just studied the architecture, he'd decided to own it. The original Marcus Vale, the real one, the legitimate lawyer who died in 2003, had been Gerald Holt's first acquisition. Holt had spent 4 years building a parallel identity using the real Vale's professional history, physical similarity, and the dead man's documentation before presenting himself to the Veyron organization in 2004. By then, he understood the Veyron-Marlowe structure better than most of its actual members. He knew where the leverage was. He knew which relationships were load-bearing and which were decorative. He knew, with the precision of someone who had mapped it from the outside, exactly where to apply pressure, and exactly how long to apply it before things broke. He had been applying that pressure for 20 years. "He's not a criminal," Elena said, sitting back from the screen. Her voice had gone flat in a way that was different from her usual flatness. Stripped rather than controlled, the sound of someone processing something genuinely new. "He's a strategist. He thinks like an analyst because he is one. Everything he's built, Victor, the Coalition, the Challenge Protocol, it's all structured like an operation, not like a power grab." "Because it's not a power grab," Dante said. He was standing behind her, reading over her shoulder, and his voice was the voice of someone who has just understood the entire geometry of a trap they've been inside for years. He doesn't want to run the organizations. He wants to own the infrastructure and use legitimate proxies to operate it. Victor gets the visible throne. Holt controls the actual plumbing. While staying completely invisible, Elena said. No criminal record under the Veil name, no territory disputes, no exposure. If anything ever comes apart, Victor takes the fall and Holt steps sideways into another identity. Dante straightened. 9 hours, he said. 9 hours to the meeting. They'd spent 4 on the drive, on the files, on the specific shape of Gerald Holt's patient 20-year construction project. The sky through the windows had shifted from deep black to the flat gray that preceded dawn. "We need to move now," he said. Elena was already standing. "Vera, I need the archive package ready in 90 minutes. The core files on Holt's identity, the federal records, the Veil substitution documentation, the MSV payment trail. Everything that traces from Holt to Victor to the challenge framework." She looked at Dante. "Do you trust Caruso?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. Caruso was the one thing he was certain of. Then Caruso delivers the package to the allied family heads, personal delivery, not electronic. Physical copies, hand to hand, before 8 a.m. She looked at him steadily. "And you need to get yourself to the meeting before Victor and Holt realize we've moved. If I walk in there without the families already knowing, you don't walk in without them knowing," she said. "Caruso gets to them first. But you have to be in that room. You have to be present when they decide what the evidence means." She paused. "So does Holt. He can't run if he's in the room." Dante looked at her. "You're going to be in the room too," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Victor will know the moment you walk in that the plan has shifted. I know. Holt will know." "Yes." "It puts a target on you." She looked at him with the particular steadiness of someone who has already done the calculation and accepted the result. "It always has," she said. "I'm just done pretending otherwise." The meeting was held at the Aldrich Club, a private facility in the business district that had been used for exactly these kinds of gatherings for 3 generations, the kind of place that looked like a supper club on the outside and functioned like a courtroom on the inside when the occasion required. Oak paneling, long tables, the particular acoustics of a room built to contain serious conversations. Dante arrived at 8:43 a.m. He'd driven himself again. He walked through the front entrance of the Aldrich Club in the same coat he'd been wearing since the previous night, with 6 hours of no sleep behind his eyes and a specific cold clarity in his chest that he recognized as the thing that replaced fear, when fear had been useful and was now finished. The reception room outside the main hall was already populated. He recognized most of the faces, family representatives, senior advisors, a few men he'd done business with for a decade, and who looked at him now with the carefully neutral expressions of people who haven't yet decided which side of a thing they're on. Caruso was near the door. He crossed to Dante immediately, close enough to keep his voice private. "Packages delivered," he said. His jaw was tight. 5 of the 7 heads received them personally before 7:30. The other 2 I reached by secure courier. All 7 confirmed receipt. "Confirmed they read them?" "Confirmed they read them," Caruso said. "Ferrante called me back 20 minutes ago. He said..." A pause. "He said he wanted to know who else in that room knew what was in the files before he decided how to respond." "Tell him everyone in the room is about to know," Dante said. He walked to the main hall doors and pushed them open. The room held 21 people. Dante saw Victor immediately, seated at the left side of the long table, in the position of a man who has arranged the seating and chosen his spot with care, his heavy face arranged into an expression of sorrowful professionalism, the performance of a man reluctantly doing what honor requires. He saw Dante enter and something moved through his eyes, fast, controlled, almost invisible, before the professional sorrow reasserted itself. He saw Marcus Vale, Gerald Holt, at the head of the table, in the presiding counsel's chair, with his legal documents arranged before him in neat stacks, and his reading glasses sitting on the bridge of his nose, and the specific composed authority of a man who believes the outcome of the next 2 hours is a formality. Holt looked up when Dante entered. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't do any of the things a man does when surprised. He simply looked, with the calm of someone for whom this was an anticipated variable, and adjusted nothing. Then the door behind Dante opened again. Elena walked in. The room changed. Not loudly. No one said anything. No one moved dramatically. But the specific quality of the air in a room changes when its assumptions are disrupted, and everyone present felt it. Victor's composure cracked at its foundation, just for a second, a hairline fracture that showed in the slight forward movement of his shoulders before he caught himself. Several of the family representatives looked between Elena and Dante with the alert, calculating attention of people rapidly revising their positions. Holt looked at Elena. For the first time, something appeared in his face that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not surprise, something more specific and more dangerous. The look of a man recalibrating in real time, running through contingencies, identifying which ones still applied. Elena walked to the right side of the table and sat down without speaking. Dante sat beside her. Victor stood. "Mr. Vale," he said, addressing Holt with the formal deference of a man playing his role to the end, "I'd like to note for the record that Elena Marlowe Veyron's presence here is irregular. This proceeding concerns internal Veyron organizational matters, and her name is Elena Marlowe," Dante said, "and she's here because she's a principal stakeholder in the matter under discussion." He looked at Holt. "Shall we proceed?" Holt studied him for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "Of course," and opened the first document on the stack before him. Well, the first 20 minutes were Victor's. He presented the case with the practiced fluency of a man who had rehearsed it. The surveillance photographs of Dante's car at the Marlowe estate. The communication log suggesting coordination between the Veyron and Marlowe networks. The argument that Dante had compromised the organization's independence by entering into an unauthorized alliance with a rival entity. He spoke without heat, which was more effective than heat would have been. He sounded like a reluctant man telling a necessary truth. The family representatives listened. Dante listened. Elena listened with her hands flat on the table and her face arranged in the particular stillness that he now understood was not passivity, but its exact opposite. A woman with enormous amounts of information, choosing very carefully the moment to release it. When Victor finished, Holt opened the succession framework document. He began to walk through the legal basis for the challenge, the organizational charter, the provisions, the precedent, with the methodical clarity of a man who had written the document himself and understood every word of it. "Before you continue," Dante said. Holt paused. "Mr. Veyron, the procedural—" "I want to ask you a question," Dante said, "and I'd like you to answer it in front of everyone in this room." Holt looked at him. The reading glasses. The neat stacks of documents. The composed authority. The procedural framework provides for— "What was your federal employee identification number?" Dante said. The room was absolutely silent. Holt did not move. "I'm sorry?" he said. "Your federal employee identification number," Dante said. "From your 12 years as an analyst at the Financial Intelligence Unit. You resigned in 1999. The number would have been on every report you submitted during that period." He paused. "Gerald." The name hit the room like a physical impact. Victor turned to look at Holt. The first genuine crack. The sorrow performance gone completely, replaced by something raw and frightened. The look of a man understanding for the first time that the person he thought was running the operation for his benefit has been running it for entirely different reasons. Holt took his reading glasses off. He folded them. He set them on the table with the precision of a man doing something familiar, while his mind works very fast somewhere else entirely. "That's a serious accusation," he said. His voice was still steady. The steadiness of someone who has been in difficult rooms before and survived them by never letting the room see the work it's taking. Elena set a document on the table. She slid it to the center. far enough that the nearest family representatives could see it without reaching. Federal employment records, she said. Gerald Holt, senior analyst, resigned under investigation 1999. The photograph on page 3 is from his federal identification. She set a second document beside the first. His work on the Veyron Marlowe network infrastructure during his federal employment. Classified analysis. Obtained through the Marlowe Archives intelligence holdings. She set a third. The Marcus Vail identity fabrication, including the acquisition of the original Vail's professional history, bar credentials, and physical documentation. She set a fourth. Payment records. Monthly transfers from an account bearing the initials MSV to Victor Sable, beginning in 2001. 2 years before the original Marcus Vail died. 2 years before Gerald Holt needed the identity. She looked at Victor. He recruited you before he had the cover in place. He needed time to build you into position. Victor's face had gone the color of old concrete. Victor, one of the family heads, Ferrante, said from across the table, his voice carrying the specific tone of a man who has read something in the last 2 hours that has reconfigured his understanding of the last several years and is now operating from controlled fury. Is this real? Victor opened his mouth. Is this real? Ferrante said again, and his voice had dropped, which was worse than if he'd raised it. The documents are, Victor started. I want a yes or a no, Ferrante said. Victor looked at Holt. Holt was looking at the documents Elena had set on the table. He was looking at them with the expression of a man doing a very fast internal assessment, running through the documents, calculating how much was actually there versus how much was implied, determining whether the evidence was sufficient to constitute an inescapable conclusion or whether there was still room for a counter-narrative. He looked up at Elena. She looked back at him steadily. In that exchange, 4 seconds, maybe 5, something was decided between them without a word, the way things sometimes get decided between two people who are each, in their own way, extraordinary at reading what the other person knows. Holt understood that she had everything. This proceeding is compromised, Holt said. He began to gather his documents. The reading glasses went into his jacket pocket. His hands moved with unhurried precision. I'm withdrawing as presiding counsel due to a conflict of interest that has been improperly... Sit down, Dante said. Holt looked at him. Sit down. Dante's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the specific quality of a man who has been afraid and is now finished being afraid, and what's replaced it is something considerably more dangerous. You're not walking out of this room until every person in it understands exactly what you've been building for 20 years. Holt sat. Not because Dante told him to. He sat because he'd run the exit calculation and understood that the 2 men at the door, large, quietly positioned, arrived with Elena's security detail, had blocked it at some point in the last 15 minutes, without anyone in the room marking the moment it happened. Dante looked at the 7 family heads. 30 years ago, our families, the Veyrons and the Marlowes, built this network together. You didn't know that. Neither did I until last night. The man sitting at the head of this table spent 12 years inside the federal government, studying that network from the outside, and the last 20 years dismantling it from the inside. He placed himself in my organization as legal counsel. He recruited my uncle as a figurehead. He used my uncle's challenge as the mechanism to transfer control of both organizations to himself, with Victor as the visible operator and himself as the invisible architect. He paused. He killed Richard Marlowe to prevent the Marlowe succession from being completed. He spent 12 years waiting for Elena to surface so he could use the divorce he engineered through Victor, to separate us before she could. The room was very still. Ferrante said, to no one in particular, he engineered the divorce. Victor's campaign against my marriage was directed by Holt, Dante said. The intelligence Victor used, the leverage he applied, the timing, all of it coordinated through the legal office, my legal office. Ferrante looked at Victor. The look of a man who has been a professional his entire life and is currently operating right at the edge of that professionalism. You let this man run you, he said, for 20 years. Victor said nothing. His hands were on the table, thick-fingered, still. He looked like a man who has reached the end of a very long performance and found that the exit he expected isn't there. Holt said, This is all very compelling. His voice had found a new register, not the presiding council's authority, something flatter and more fundamental. But documentation in a criminal proceeding requires verification, chain of custody, attribution. What you've presented is a collection of files from an archive with no independently verified provenance. He looked around the room, not with hope, but with the reflexive expertise of a man who has argued his way out of corners before. The Marlowe archive is claimed to be legitimate. That claim has not been verified by any neutral party. I'd suggest that before any of you make decisions based on the federal employment records are publicly verifiable, Elena said. The photograph can be matched to biometric standards. The payment records bear account numbers that any forensic accountant in this room can trace within 48 hours. She looked at him without emotion. You've spent 20 years being unverifiable, Mr. Holt. You built the identity very carefully, but you made one consistent error. He looked at her. You used your real initials, she said, on the payment records, MSV, Marcus Samuel Vale. But your name before you took that identity was Gerald Martin Holt. She paused. GMH, not MSV. So the initials on the payments aren't a reference to the Vale identity. She held his gaze. They're a reference to the entity the payments were run through. The shell company your father established in 1987, which you inherited and never dissolved because you assumed no one who was looking for Gerald Holt would ever think to look at a 40-year-old legitimate holding company. She set the fifth document on the table. Meridian Sable Vale LLC. Named, we believe, with Victor's name in the center because you needed his cooperation, and that was your way of making him feel like a partner. Holt looked at the document. His face didn't change, but his hands did. A slight shift, a tightening, the one involuntary response his 20 years of careful self-control hadn't fully extinguished. Victor made a sound, not a word. Something that wasn't language, the sound of a man understanding, all at once, that his name had been used as a placeholder in someone else's corporate architecture, that he'd been a middle word in a company name for as long as he'd believed he was building toward a throne. He turned and looked at Holt. The look on his face was the look of a man who has spent 61 years in a world where betrayal was a professional transaction and has just discovered that he is capable, still, of feeling it personally. You put my name in the company, Victor said. His voice was barely a voice. Holt said nothing. You put my name in it like I was part of it, Victor said. You were useful, Holt said. And the flatness of it, the utter absence of softening, was worse than anything else he could have said. Victor's chair scraped back. It happened fast, faster than a 61-year-old man had any right to move, propelled by the specific energy of humiliation that has finally found a physical direction. He was around the table in 4 strides, his hand going for Holt's collar, and Holt came out of his chair backward. And for a moment it was simply 2 men and gravity and the accumulated weight of 20 years of constructed loyalty collapsing into its actual shape, which was nothing, which had always been nothing. And then Dante's security was between them, and the room was on its feet, and someone was shouting, and Ferrante was standing with both hands flat on the table, saying, "Enough," with the authority of a man who has presided over worse and will not allow this room to become a spectacle. The security men separated Victor and Holt. Victor was breathing hard. His jacket was pulled at the shoulder. He looked at Holt across the room with an expression that had passed beyond anger into something more fundamental. The stripped, bewildered look of a man who has discovered that the story of his own life was authored by someone else. Holt straightened his tie. He looked around the room. Family heads, security, Dante, Elena, the documents on the table, the doors with men in front of them. He did the calculation one more time with the methodical precision that had carried him this far. He sat back down. "I'd like to speak with counsel," he said. "You are counsel," Ferrante said. His voice was dry. "Or you were." The vote was not close. 7 family heads, 7 decisions made on the basis of documents received before 8 a.m. and confirmed in the previous 90 minutes. Victor's challenge failed unanimously. The succession framework Holt had spent 2 years building was declared void. Pending investigation, all access associated with the Marcus Vale identity was suspended immediately. It took 11 minutes. Dante sat at the table and watched it happen and felt none of the things he'd expected to feel. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter, and more uncomfortable. The specific sensation of a man who has survived something that should have destroyed him and is now sitting in the wreckage of the assumptions that made him vulnerable to it in the first place. Holt was escorted from the room by Ferrante's men. The legal position he'd occupied for 20 years was gone, and with it the architecture of the identity he'd built, and what remained was Gerald Holt, a federal analyst who had looked at other people's power and decided to take it, sitting in a car being driven to a location that was not a police station, but that would have its own kind of reckoning. Victor didn't leave easily. He stood at the door of the room and looked back at Dante, and the look was complicated. Not the performance of sorrow, not the calculation of a man still running odds. Something simpler than either. "I built you," Victor said. "I was there when my father built a partnership with Richard Marlowe," Dante said, "and you buried it and told me it never existed. You used everything he left me to serve someone who put your name in a shell company and called you useful." He held his uncle's gaze. "Don't tell me what you built." Victor left. The room emptied slowly. Family heads in conversation with their advisors, the sound of chairs and footsteps, and the specific hum of a situation that has resolved in a way that requires processing. Caruso stood near the door. Vera sat to one side with her hands in her lap, watching everything with the patience of someone who has been watching things for a long time. Elena remained at the table. She and Dante were the last two in the room. He looked at the documents still spread across the table, the photograph, the letter, the shell company records, the accumulated paper evidence of a 20-year plan that had come within hours of working. "Holt will talk," Elena said, "to someone, eventually. I know. When he does, a great deal comes out that neither of us controls." "I know that too." He looked at her. She looked tired in the way she'd looked at the estate, in the way she'd looked for years, probably. A tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the sustained effort of carrying something heavy without showing it. "Elena." She looked at him. "What you built," he said. "The archive, the network, the 12 years of rebuilding while you kept yourself invisible. Your father would—" "Don't," she said quietly. He stopped. She looked at the documents for a moment. "He made careful plans," she said. "He hid things. He wrote letters. He left keys with strangers." She straightened the edge of a paper that didn't need straightening. "He did everything except stay alive long enough to tell me himself." The room held that. Outside, the city was fully into its mourning, traffic and voices and the ordinary machinery of a world that had no knowledge of what had just happened in this room. Dante looked at his hands on the table. He thought about Gerald Holt's hands on the same table 40 minutes ago. He thought about his father's hands in a photograph 30 years old. "What happens now?" he said. Elena looked at the window. "Now," she said, "we deal with what we actually have instead of what we thought we had." She stood up. She picked up the documents, all of them, carefully, in the order she'd set them down, returning them to the folder with the same precision her father had used when he sealed an envelope with wax the color of dried blood and put it in a safe and hoped that whoever opened it next would be ready for what was inside. She looked at Dante one more time. "Come to the estate," she said. "There's one more thing in the secondary archive that neither of us has looked at yet, my father's last entry." She paused at the door. "It's dated the day before he died." She walked out. Dante sat alone in the long room with the oak paneling and the empty chairs and the morning light coming through the windows. And he understood that whatever came next, whatever reckoning, whatever rebuilding, whatever accounting for the years of damage, it was going to require him to be a different kind of man than the one who had placed divorce papers on a table at 2 a.m. and called it the end. He wasn't sure yet what kind of man that was. But he stood up. He followed her out the door, into the ordinary morning, toward whatever the last page of Richard Marlowe's last entry said. Richard Marlowe's last entry was 7 pages long. Elena read it aloud. She didn't plan to. She'd intended to read it privately first, to filter whatever it contained through her own judgment before deciding what to share and how much. But when she opened the file on the air-gapped laptop in her father's study and saw the date at the top, the day before he died, written at 2 a.m., the same hour Dante had placed divorce papers on a table 2 weeks ago, something in her chest gave way in a manner she hadn't anticipated, and she started reading before she'd made a conscious decision to. And by the time she understood she was reading aloud, Dante was already listening, and it was too late to stop, and she found she didn't want to. Her father wrote the way he talked, plainly, without decoration, with the specific precision of a man who understood that clarity was a form of respect for whoever came after. He wrote about the Veyron partnership. He wrote about the years of building something he believed was more durable than the alternatives, more honest in its way about what power actually required. He wrote about the moment he first noticed the anomaly in the legal structure, a document with Marcus Vale's signature that referenced a provision Vale had never been briefed on, which meant someone was using the Vale identity to generate paperwork that wasn't being run through the actual Vale's office. He wrote about the 3 weeks he'd spent trying to identify who that someone was, and the dead ends, and the slowly building certainty that whatever he was looking at was much older and much more deliberate than an opportunistic fraud. He wrote about Victor Sable, not with anger, with a kind of exhausted clarity, the tone of a man who has discovered that someone he trusted was never trustworthy and has already moved through the phase of feeling betrayed into the phase of simply documenting what is true. He wrote about Victor's early approaches, the information sharing that had seemed collegial and now read as reconnaissance. He wrote about 3 specific conversations with Giulio Veyron, Dante's father, in which Giulio had expressed concern about Victor's growing independence but had not yet identified it as a threat. He wrote, Giulio was loyal to the wrong idea of Victor. He kept believing that what Victor showed him was what Victor was. I understood that error because I made it too, for longer than I should have. Elena's voice stayed level through this. Dante sat across the desk from her and said nothing and let her read, and she was grateful for that, for the specific grace of a man who understood, in this moment, that the correct thing was to be present without filling the space. Her father wrote about the decision to transfer the archive. He wrote, I am giving Elena everything I have built because she is the only person I have ever met who understands that information is not power until you understand when not to use it. Her patience frightens me sometimes. It also makes me certain she will survive what comes after I'm gone. She will survive it because she will not let it make her into something harder than she needs to be. That is the most important thing I can leave her, not the files, not the network, the understanding that strength and severity are not the same thing. Elena stopped. She looked at the screen. She did not cry, but she sat very still for a moment, the way you sit when something has moved through you that you can't stop and can't fully contain, and the only available response is to hold yourself carefully until it passes. Dante looked at his hands on the desk. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer anything. He just sat there and let her have it, and she found, unexpectedly, that this was the most useful thing he had ever done for her. She kept reading. The last 2 pages were about Holt. Her father had gotten further than Elena knew. He had a partial name, not Gerald Holt, but a federal case reference number that, when Elena had run it through the archive's intelligence files the previous night, pointed directly to Holt's investigation and resignation. He had the shell company. He had 3 of the payment records. He had, in the final paragraph, a single sentence that he had underlined twice with a hand that pressed hard enough to leave an impression in the page beneath. Whatever you do with what I've left you, do not let it make you into the thing that made it necessary. Elena closed the file. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. He knew, she said. He knew most of it. He just ran out of time to get to the name. He got to the important part, Dante said. She looked at him. The part about you, he said. He said it without inflection. Not tenderly, not strategically, just as a simple, accurate statement of what the document contained. He was right. Elena looked out the window at the grounds. The bare November trees, the men at the perimeter, the flat gray sky that had been there all morning. He was right about a lot of things, she said. He was also wrong about some. He thought the partnership with your family was something that could be preserved indefinitely. He didn't account for what happened when the people who built it were gone, or for what happened when the people who inherited it never knew it existed. No, she said. He didn't account for that. They sat with that for a moment. Well, Holt talked on the 3rd day. Not to law enforcement, there was a conversation happening in parallel channels about how and whether law enforcement entered this situation at all. A conversation that involved lawyers and family representatives and the specific pragmatism of people who live in a world where the formal legal system is one tool among many rather than the primary arbiter of consequence. Holt talked to Ferrante in a room that had no recording equipment and two men at the door, and the understanding, clearly communicated by Ferrante's expression alone, that the conversation was going to be complete or it was going to be very unpleasant. He talked for 4 hours. What came out confirmed everything the archive had documented and added dimensions that even Richard Marlowe's careful intelligence gathering hadn't captured. Holt had spent 12 years inside the Federal Financial Unit specifically seeking out the Veyron-Marlowe network, not as an investigation, but as a study. He had identified it as the most sophisticated criminal infrastructure on the East Coast, had mapped it completely, and had decided, with the cold ambition of a man who has spent his career watching other people accumulate power, that he wanted it. The original Marcus Vail had been an accident of opportunity, a man of similar build and professional background who died of natural causes at the precise moment Holt was ready to make his move. He had spent 18 months rebuilding himself as Vail before approaching the Veyron organization, and the first thing he had done upon gaining access to the legal structure was identify every weakness that could be exploited, document it, and file it away for later use. Victor had been recruited not because Holt needed muscle, but because he needed a face, someone with legitimate standing inside the organization, someone whose challenge to Dante's leadership would be recognized as procedurally valid by the allied families. Victor had been, in the most precise sense, a costume Holt wore to the meeting he'd spent 20 years preparing for. When Ferrante relayed the substance of the conversation to Dante and Elena, he did it in the same room of the Marlowe estate where Richard Marlowe had written his last entry, sitting across the desk with his jacket still on and his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that Elena had provided and that he held without drinking from, as though he needed the warmth of it more than the contents. "He has no remorse," Ferrante said. "I want to be clear about that. He's not frightened particularly. He's—" a pause. "He's annoyed. That's the accurate word. He's annoyed that it didn't work." "He'll try again," Elena said. "Not from where he's going," Ferrante said. Elena accepted this. She didn't ask for specifics. In the world she'd grown up in and the world she'd chosen to operate in, there were outcomes that didn't have clean language and didn't need it, and the important thing was that the outcome was real. Dante, sitting to her left, said nothing. He hadn't asked for specifics either. He was learning in these days a new relationship to information, what he needed to know versus what he was accustomed to insisting on knowing, because insisting had felt like control. He was learning that control and awareness were different instruments, and that he'd been using one in places that required the other for his entire adult life. "Victor," Ferrante said, "that's a harder question." "How was used," Elena said. "He was also complicit," Ferrante said. "The challenge he mounted was real. The coalition he built was real. Holt provided the intelligence and the structure, but Victor made the decisions." He looked at Dante. "What do you want to do?" Dante looked at his hands. He thought about the photograph, his father and Richard Marlowe and Victor Sable in a restaurant 30 years ago, raising glasses, whatever they were celebrating. He thought about Victor in the doorway of the Aldrich Club saying, "I built you," and the crack in his voice when Holt said you were useful, and the stripped, bewildered look of a man discovering at 61 that the story of his life was someone else's draft. "He's finished," Dante said. "Everything he built inside the organization is gone. He knows it. He has nothing left to leverage." He paused. "Let him be finished. That's enough." Ferrante nodded. He drank from the coffee mug. He set it down. "The alliance structure," he said, moving forward. "Practically speaking, with the Vail legal framework voided and the succession documents invalidated, there are gaps that need to be addressed." "I know," Dante said. "The families will need some form of continuity framework going forward. There are interests that have been operating under arrangements that no longer have a legal basis." Ferrante looked at him carefully. "You could rebuild. The recognition is still there. After this morning, arguably stronger." Dante said nothing immediately. Elena said nothing. Ferrante looked between them. Something in his expression shifted, the calibration of a man reading a room and revising what he expected to find there. "Or," he said slowly, "you could make a different decision." "Yes," Elena said. "We could." The different decision took 3 weeks to begin implementing and would take considerably longer to complete. It started with the foundation documents that Elena had been drafting for 2 years, since long before the divorce, since the early months of her marriage, when she'd begun to understand with certainty that the world she'd been born into was not one she could repair from inside, but might be possible to dismantle from within, if she was patient and careful and willing to accept that the process would cost her things she cared about. The Marlowe Foundation for Family Stability. The name was deliberately prosaic, the kind of name that didn't attract attention, that sounded like 100 other charitable entities incorporated in Delaware every year, received its first legitimate asset transfer on a Tuesday morning in December. The assets came from the Marlowe Network's above-board holdings, real estate, legitimate business interests, financial instruments that had been built on criminal infrastructure but had long since become self-sustaining on their own terms. Elena signed each transfer document herself. Vera witnessed them. The process took most of the morning and was, from a purely administrative standpoint, entirely unremarkable. Papers, signatures, notarizations, the quiet bureaucratic machinery of one entity becoming another. What was remarkable was what the foundation was designed to do. It was designed to provide legal assistance, housing support, and economic rehabilitation to families damaged by organized crime, not in a general or abstract way, but specifically and practically, with a staff of attorneys and social workers and financial counselors, and a board of directors that included, deliberately, 3 people who had spent time in federal custody as a result of the world the Marlowe Network had helped build. Elena had chosen those 3 board members herself. She had called each of them personally. The conversations had been brief and direct, and, in each case, had included a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough to suggest the person was working through a response more complex than simple acceptance or refusal. All 3 had said yes. Dante watched the transfer documents come across the desk and thought about his father's handwriting on a 30-year-old agreement and the specific kind of building that both their fathers had done, patient, layered, designed to last, and understood that what Elena was doing was the same impulse turned in a different direction, the same quality of mind, the same willingness to think across decades rather than quarters. He thought about what that cost her. He signed the Veyron dissolution documents on a Wednesday. They were less elaborate. The Veyron organization had less legitimate infrastructure to redirect, more of its holdings being so deeply entangled in the criminal structure that the cleanest option was simply to walk away. Several of the legitimate businesses were transferred to employees who'd run them operationally for years and deserved to own what they'd built. 2 properties went to Caruso, who had served with a loyalty that Dante had taken for granted and was now acknowledging in the only language that meant anything. The rest was released. He didn't keep the estate. That surprised him when he made the decision. He'd expected it to be harder, to feel like amputation, to require some significant internal negotiation. Instead, it felt like setting down something he'd been carrying past the point of usefulness out of habit and stubbornness rather than need. The Calderon estate went to a community organization that would convert it into a residential facility. The process took paperwork and time and a conversation with an administrator who kept glancing at him across a desk, with the expression of a man trying to determine whether this was a legitimate philanthropic act or an elaborate tax maneuver. It was neither, Dante had told him. The administrator had looked uncertain, which was reasonable. Certainty, in this situation, would have suggested a failure of imagination. They met at the Marlowe estate in the 3rd week of December, on a day that had a particular winter quality to it, bright and cold and very clear, the kind of day that makes everything look like it has sharp edges. Elena was in the study. Dante knocked before entering, which he hadn't done at the estate in 5 years of marriage, and the knock said something that neither of them acknowledged directly. She was at the desk with a stack of foundation correspondence, requests, applications, inquiries from people and organizations who had heard, through whatever channels this kind of information travels, that resources were becoming available. The stack was already substantial. It would get considerably larger. He sat across from her. "The families have accepted the dissolution," he said. Ferrante presided. "Unanimous recognition." "I know," she said. "Vera told me." "Of course she did." A quiet moment. Outside, a wind moved through the bare trees and pressed briefly against the windows. "The secondary archive," Dante said. "The original founding documents. The photograph." He looked at her. "What are you going to do with them?" "Seal them," she said. "Properly this time. In a depository that isn't connected to any person or organization with an interest in their contents. She folded the letter she'd been reading and set it aside. Their history, not leverage. The distinction matters. He nodded. There's something I need to say, he said. She looked at him. He didn't look away. He held her gaze with the specific difficulty of a man who is accustomed to managing his expression and is deliberately not doing that. I dismissed you, he said, every time you tried. Every warning, every question, every moment where you were standing right in front of me with something important, and I turned it into evidence that you were… He stopped. I made you invisible because I decided it was safer, for you, for the house, for the version of things I needed to believe. He paused. That's not an explanation. I know what it looks like from where you were standing. Elena was quiet for a moment. You're right, she said. It's not an explanation. No. You want to know if I forgive you, she said. I don't think I have the right to want that, he said. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, or maybe they had been there and she'd stopped seeing them, the way you stop seeing the details of things you've decided you already know. She looked at the way he was sitting, not the territorial stillness of a powerful man in a room, but something more stripped down than that, a man present without performance. I'm not angry, she said, finally. I want you to know that. It's not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness implies I'm releasing something that's been held, and I've been carrying this lightly for a while now. The anger burned out a long time ago. She looked at her hands on the desk. What I am is honest about what it was. You are very good at building walls and calling them protection. I'm very good at working around walls and calling it patience. We were both doing the thing we knew how to do, and between us we built something that looked like a marriage from a distance. It wasn't, he said. No, she said. Not the way it should have been. He exhaled. And now? She looked at him. I'm not asking for something, he said carefully. I'm asking what now means for the foundation, for… He stopped. For whatever comes after this. Elena was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet that was hers, inhabited, deliberate, full rather than empty. The foundation needs a legal counsel, she said, not Vale's kind. Someone who understands the architecture of what we're dismantling and can make sure the transition doesn't leave gaps that someone else steps into. She looked at him steadily. There are going to be people who see what we're doing as an opportunity, as territory opening up. That's a problem that requires active management for probably the next 5 years. I know people who can help with that, he said. I know you do, she said. That's why I'm telling you. Is that what now means, he said, professionally. She looked at him for a moment longer than the question required. I don't know what now means beyond that, she said. I'm not ready to know. And I think you understand honestly that neither are you. She looked back at the correspondence on her desk. What I know is that my father left me something that was supposed to protect a criminal empire, and I'm using it to dismantle one instead. And I know I can't do that alone. She picked up the next letter in the stack. And I know that you knocked before you came in. Dante looked at her. Something in his chest, some specific tightness that had been there so long he'd stopped feeling it as unusual, and had started feeling it as just the way his chest worked, loosened slightly. Not gone, but changed. The difference between a knot pulled tight against resistance and one beginning, slowly, to give. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked out the window at the December trees and the flat, bright sky, and then he looked back at her. At the woman who had signed his divorce papers without hesitation and walked out his door with 1 suitcase and 32 cars waiting because she'd known exactly who she was while he'd spent 5 years deciding she was someone simpler. I'll make some calls, he said. I know you will, she said. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, not quite the same pause as in the Aldrich Club. Not the pause of someone bracing for a final blow. The pause of someone who is about to leave a room and knows it matters, this time how they leave it. Elena, he said. She looked up. Your father was right about you, he said. She held his gaze. I was right about you too, she said quietly. Eventually, he left. She sat at the desk for a long time after she heard his car leave the drive. She sat with the correspondence and the bare winter trees in the window and the silence of the house, which was a different silence from the ones she'd grown up in. Those had been full of other people, full of the movement and noise of a family and an enterprise, all the overlapping machinery of a life that had seemed permanent and had not been. This silence was hers. She'd built it, or grown into it, over 12 years of careful work in rooms that nobody was watching. It was not empty. It was the silence of something that had found its right shape. She opened the next letter. It was from a woman in New Jersey, 3 pages handwritten, describing what had happened to her family over the course of 9 years of entanglement with an organization that had promised protection and delivered the opposite. The letter was specific. It named things. It didn't ask for sympathy. It asked practically whether the foundation could help with the legal costs of a custody dispute that had been complicated by her husband's criminal record. Elena read it twice. She wrote a response on Marlowe Foundation letterhead, 3 paragraphs, with the contact information of the intake attorney and the assurance that the application would be reviewed within 2 weeks. She signed it with her full name. She folded it, addressed the envelope, set it in the outgoing pile. She reached for the next letter. Outside, the winter light was beginning to thin toward afternoon, the short December day already deciding it had given enough. Vera came to the study door at some point and set a cup of tea on the corner of the desk without speaking, which was the specific language of someone who had known you long enough to understand when presence was needed and speech wasn't. Elena thanked her without looking up. She kept working. The correspondence pile was substantial. It would be more substantial by the end of the week. By the end of the month, the foundation would have more requests than it could immediately address, which meant it needed structure and staffing and the careful prioritization of limited resources. All the unglamorous administrative work of building something real rather than something impressive. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. Her father had known it. She'd known it. The knowledge had been waiting inside her through 5 years of making herself invisible, patient as the archive in the safe, waiting to be useful. She thought about Dante's voice saying your father was right about you. She thought about her own voice answering eventually. She hadn't planned to say that. It came out of some honest place she hadn't been guarding in that particular moment, the way true things sometimes escape when you're tired enough that the careful management has worn through. And it was true. He had been right, eventually. He had followed her out of the Aldrich Club without being asked. He had sat in this room and listened to her read her father's words without once trying to make it about himself. He had knocked before he came in. These were small things. They were also not small. She picked up the next letter. The December light kept thinning. The house was warm. Somewhere in the north wing, 2 of Vera's assistants were working through the secondary archive, cataloging, redacting, preparing the documents for the depository transfer in a way that preserved the historical record without preserving the leverage. The work was careful and slow, the way the right work tends to be. By the time Elena reached the bottom of the correspondence pile, it was early evening, the sky outside gone the deep blue that comes just before dark in winter, when the cold makes the air itself seem thinner and everything at the edges of vision has a slight luminous clarity. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the desk, her father's desk, claimed as her own, the surface worn in the specific places where his hands had rested over decades of this same work. Different work. The same impulse behind it, the same belief that the structures people lived within could be changed if you were patient and precise and willing to accept that change happened in correspondence piles and legal documents and small, careful conversations rather than in dramatic confrontations. The dramatic confrontations happened too, but they didn't build anything. They only cleared ground. She thought about 32 black cars in the rain. She thought about what it had cost to be ready for that night. Not the logistics of it, the cars and the men and the convoy, but the years of quiet before it. The years of sitting at his table and asking careful questions and carrying alone the weight of what she knew while he looked past her toward the things he considered real. The years of being the woman beside him, so thoroughly beside him that he'd stopped seeing her as a person with a direction of her own. She had never blamed him for that, not entirely. She had also never been fully honest with herself about how much it had worn her down in ways she hadn't noticed until she signed her name at the bottom of the divorce papers and picked up her pen and set it down and felt, underneath the clarity of having finally moved, the specific ache of a thing that could have been different and wasn't. It couldn't have been different. She knew that now. Not because of his failures, though those were real, but because the people they'd been when they married were not yet capable of building what the situation required. She had been too defended. He had been too armored. Between them, they'd constructed a beautiful, sterile distance and called it a life together. What they'd built in the last 3 weeks, working through the night at this desk, in the Aldrich Club room, in the phone calls at hours that had no business having phone calls in them, was different. Not a marriage, not even a partnership in the conventional sense. Something harder to name, built from the specific material of two people who had looked at each other clearly, finally, under conditions that made pretense impossible. She didn't know what it would become. She thought her father would have said that not knowing was acceptable, that the willingness to work towards something without knowing its final shape was itself a form of integrity, that the alternative, holding back until the outcome was guaranteed, was just fear given a more respectable name. She stood up. She gathered the outgoing correspondence. She carried it to the hall and set it on the table near the front door for the morning pickup. She turned off the study lamp. She walked through the house, checking rooms the way you check rooms at the end of a day, not because anything needs checking, but because the routine of it is itself a kind of comfort, the physical enactment of the day closing. The photograph was gone from the desk. She'd sent it with the documents to the depository, but she carried the image of it clearly, her father's face, young and relaxed, at a table with men he trusted, holding a glass toward a future he couldn't see. She went upstairs. She stood at the window of her room for a moment, looking out at the dark grounds, the perimeter lights, the bare trees standing in the cold like patient things that have learned to wait for the season to change because they understand, in whatever way trees understand anything, that it will. She thought about Dante driving back through the city. She thought about him walking into whatever space he was rebuilding his life inside and sitting down at a desk that wasn't the estate's desk and making the calls he'd said he would make, and doing the careful, unglamorous work of becoming useful to something other than himself. She thought he would do it. She thought he might surprise himself with how much he was capable of, given the chance. People often did, when the version of themselves they'd built for other people's consumption was finally retired and what was underneath had room to operate. She turned from the window. She sat on the edge of the bed and took off her shoes and set them side by side on the floor with the automatic neatness of someone who has spent a long time making sure the small things were in order because the large things were, for years, outside her control. The large things were not outside her control anymore. She lay down. The house settled around her, old stone and old wood doing what they do in the cold, making the small sounds of endurance. Outside, the December dark was complete, and the stars were the kind that appear only when the air is cold enough to clarify everything, sharp and very far away, and entirely indifferent to the specific human dramas occurring beneath them. Elena Marlowe closed her eyes. She was not at peace, exactly. Peace suggested the absence of work, and there was considerable work ahead. Months of it, probably years. The kind that doesn't resolve cleanly, but accumulates into something real through the patient repetition of correct actions. The foundation correspondence, the archive transfer, the gaps in the East Coast power structure that would attract opportunists who needed to be managed. The slow, careful process of building something honest from materials that had not historically been used for honesty. She was ready for it. That was what she was. Not peaceful. Ready. She thought of her father's last sentence, underlined twice with a hand that pressed hard. Do not let it make you into the thing that made it necessary. She hadn't. She carried that with her into sleep, on a cold December night in her father's house, in a life that was entirely her own, finally, in the way it had always been meant to be. Outside, the last black Rolls-Royce sat in the drive. Not 32 this time, just one, its engine off, its presence simply practical and unremarkable. One of Vera's men would drive it to the main depot in the morning. It would join the rest of the fleet, most of which had already been quietly repurposed or released. The convoy that had come for her in the rain 3 weeks ago had done its job. The statement had been made. The era it announced was already becoming something else. The night was cold and quiet and very clear, and Elena Marlowe slept, deeply and without dreaming, for the first time in years.